She had a valid business class ticket and did everything right, yet at 35,000 feet, a quiet teenage girl became a problem no one wanted to name. What happened next would freeze an entire cabin and change lives long after landing. If stories about justice, dignity, and silent strength matter to you like the video, subscribe and stay with me for this one. Ariel Moore boarded the aircraft with the quiet restraint of someone who had learned long before adulthood how to move through expensive spaces without disturbing them, her posture relaxed but careful, her phone held low in her hand, displaying a perfectly valid business-class boarding pass. Seat 1A, an assignment she had checked 3 times. Not out of doubt but habit, because certainty had never stopped questions before. The jet bridge hummed with the soft mechanical whine of late-night boarding, and the cabin door stood open like a mouth already mid-conversation, swallowing passengers in tailored jackets and polished shoes as they stepped forward with the confidence of people who never expected to be delayed. And Ariel slipped into the priority lane, naturally, not boldly, not hesitantly, just where she was told to stand. Yet the moment she reached the threshold, something subtle shifted, not loud enough to name, but sharp enough to feel as Helen Crawford. The lead flight attendant stationed at the door tilted her head slightly and leaned forward, lowering her voice to a gentle murmur that barely carried over the ambient noise, and said, "Could you wait just a moment?" And the sentence was framed as a courtesy, delivered with a soft smile that gave Ariel no clear reason to object, so she did what she had always done in moments like this, and stepped half a pace aside, immediately wondering if she had misread the sign or misunderstood the boarding order, even though the glowing letters on her screen had not changed. Behind her, the line continued to move, a man in a navy blazer and silver watch slipping past with an apologetic nod that did not quite meet her eyes, followed by a woman wheeling a carry-on that matched her shoes. Both of them greeted with the effortless warmth of welcome aboard, and Ariel stood there alone, the priority lane suddenly empty in front of her, the carpet beneath her sneakers feeling thinner somehow, as if the ground itself had lost confidence in her presence, and she became acutely aware of the small things, the faint scent of recycled air and the distant clink of glassware inside the cabin while she waited, telling herself it was nothing that patience was safer than protest. When Helen finally turned back, the scanner chirped green the instant Ariel lifted her phone, the sound clear and decisive, the kind of electronic confirmation that should have ended the interaction entirely. Yet Helen did not step aside right away, did not say welcome or thank you, but let her eyes linger, not scanning the screen, not checking the name, but resting on Ariel herself for a few seconds too long to be accidental. And then came the question, casual, almost conversational. "Are you traveling alone?" Which caught Ariel off guard, not because it was invasive, but because it was unnecessary, because no one else had been asked it, because the answer had no bearing on the seat she had paid for or the rules of the flight. And still, Ariel nodded and said yes, her voice calm and even. Even as a familiar tension tightened in her chest, the old instinct to minimize herself rising quietly to the surface, reminding her not to sound defensive, not to explain unless asked, not to offer details that could be misinterpreted. Helen hummed softly in response, a sound that suggested acknowledgement without agreement, and stepped aside, at last, allowing Ariel to pass into the cabin. But the moment had already done its work, leaving behind a thin residue of doubt that followed her down the aisle like a second shadow, and as Ariel reached seat 1A, a window seat framed by soft lighting and brushed metal, and lifted her worn canvas backpack into the overhead bin, she felt the faint prickle of awareness along her neck, the sense that she was being observed not with curiosity, but with appraisal, measured against an expectation she had never been invited to learn, and she settled into her seat, carefully smoothing her hoodie against the leather, reminding herself that she belonged here because she had done everything right, because the ticket was real, because the seat was hers. Even as she could not quite shake the feeling that the flight had already begun to tilt in a direction she did not choose, that a single polite sentence and one unnecessary question had quietly marked her as different. Not wrong, not yet, but different enough for the story to begin before the plane ever left the ground. Ariel settled into seat 1A with the careful ease of someone who did not want to disturb the room, easing back into the leather as if it might protest her weight, tucking her backpack neatly away, sliding her headphones over her ears. Not to escape the cabin, but to give it fewer reasons to notice her. And she opened her sketchbook to a blank page, letting the soft scratch of graphite become a private anchor while the aircraft continued to fill the muted conversations around her, blending into a low, expensive hum that felt rehearsed, predictable, safe for everyone, except the person quietly wondering whether safety included her. From the corner of her eye, she sensed movement in the forward galley, where Helen Crawford stood with the controlled posture of someone who had already decided what kind of flight this would be. Her voice lowered just enough to pass as professional discretion as she leaned toward a younger flight attendant and murmured, "Keep an eye on seat 1A," a sentence that carried no accusation, yet somehow transformed a seat into a subject, a location into a question, and Noah, the junior attendant, followed Helen's gaze, instinctively noticing Ariel for the first time, not as a passenger, but as a point of interest. And he hesitated, glancing down at the handheld device he carried, the quiet screen, reflecting back lines of data that did not match the tension in Helen's voice, because the system was clear. The fare confirmed the assignment correct, and when he spoke, it was barely above a whisper. Careful not to challenge authority outright, the system shows a valid business class ticket, a statement offered like a small bridge back to neutrality. But Helen did not take it, did not look at the screen, did not soften, only straightened slightly, and replied with a thin certainty that felt practiced. "The system isn't wrong, people are." And in that moment, something subtle locked into place, a shift, not in policy, but in perception, where evidence became secondary to instinct, and instinct was allowed to outrank fact. Ariel, unaware of the exchange, yet sensitive to the change it produced, felt the temperature of the cabin alter in a way that had nothing to do with air conditioning. The smiles of the crew stopping just short of her row, the service flowing around her like water diverted by an unseen barrier, and she told herself it was coincidence that she was reading too much into silence, that the faint stiffness in Helen's posture, when their eyes briefly met, meant nothing at all. And so she focused on her drawing, sketching the curve of the window frame, the blurred lights beyond the glass, letting her shoulders relax as she tried to reclaim the simple pleasure of being in motion towards somewhere else. Yet even in stillness, she could feel herself being measured, not actively confronted, but quietly assessed. The way people sometimes do when they are deciding whether a presence fits a story they already believe, and Helen's eyes returned to her more than once from the galley, not lingering long enough to be rude, just enough to confirm that Ariel was still there, still occupying the seat that had unsettled her. And Noah noticed, too, the repeated glances, the subtle tightening of instructions, the way Helen framed every action as precaution rather than preference, and when he passed Ariel's row to check overhead bins, he slowed for half a second, searching her face for something he could name a sign of defiance or disorder that would justify the attention. But he found only a girl drawing quietly, her expression neutral, almost guarded, and the absence of misbehavior unsettled him more than its presence might have, because it left no clear explanation for the vigilance. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding wrapped up, and Ariel lifted her eyes just long enough to register that she was the only person in the forward rows not engaged in conversation or a screen, her solitude standing out against the soft social choreography around her. And she wondered briefly whether choosing to be quiet had been a mistake, whether silence invited projection in ways that speech did not. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar resolve to endure, to let the flight pass without incident, to arrive and leave without leaving a trace. In the galley, Helen adjusted her scarf and reviewed the manifest again, not to verify facts, but to reassure herself that attention had been properly assigned, that the irregularity she sensed had not gone unnoticed, and Noah watched her with growing unease, aware that something more than routine was unfolding, yet unsure how to intervene without becoming part of it. And when he glanced once more at his device, confirming again that nothing was out of place, the words Helen had spoken echoed in his mind, reshaping the data before him, and Ariel, unaware of how close scrutiny had moved to decision, closed her sketchbook and rested her hands in her lap. Breathing slowly, feeling the plane push back from the gate, trusting that the simple truth of her presence would be enough. Not knowing that the question of whether she belonged had already been answered elsewhere, in a way she could not hear, and that the attention fixed on her seat was no longer passive, but poised, waiting for a reason that did not yet exist but no longer seemed necessary. The cabin settled into its early flight rhythm as the aircraft leveled off a practiced quiet, descending over the business class rows where service moved with unspoken choreography. And Ariel noticed the pattern immediately, not because she was watching for it, but because it curved around her like a river, splitting at a stone glasses of water placed gently on tray tables to her left and right. Polite murmurs exchanged eye contact, made and held, while her own space remained untouched, her tray table bare. Her presence acknowledged only by absence, and at first she assumed it was timing that the cart would return, that she had simply been skipped by accident. So she waited, keeping her posture still, her hands folded loosely, reminding herself not to read intent into delay. Yet the minutes stretched and the cart passed again, still diverting, still leaving her dry throat and tightening chest as quiet evidence of something she could not yet name. And when she finally pressed the call button, it felt like a small act of courage, rather than convenience, a soft chime marking her seat as needing attention. And Helen arrived promptly, but not warmly, stopping just far enough away that she did not need to bend or lower herself to Ariel's eye level. Her expression neutral, composed, her voice measured and cool as she asked, "Is there something you need?" A question framed without hostility, yet stripped of the warmth Ariel had seen given freely to others. And Ariel answered politely, asking for water, keeping her tone even, careful not to sound demanding. And Helen nodded once, not apologizing, not explaining, simply turning away to retrieve the glass, as if the omission had been part of the plan rather than a mistake. And when the water arrived, it was placed down without comment. The exchange transactional finished before it could become anything else. Ariel thanked her anyway, because gratitude had always felt safer than protest, and she watched Helen move on, resuming her flow through the cabin. The brief interruption already folded into routine, yet something had shifted the attention around her, sharpening not into confrontation, but into awareness. The kind that isolates by pretending not to notice, and as Ariel lifted the glass to her lips, she became conscious of the quiet of how few sounds came from her row, compared to the gentle murmur elsewhere, and she wondered whether her silence amplified itself, whether being unobtrusive made her more visible rather than less. A few seats away, a passenger leaned back and glanced in her direction, his tone light, almost playful, as he spoke aloud. "Kids get to sit up here now," and the comment drew a ripple of restrained amusement from those nearby. Not laughter exactly, but the subtle acknowledgement that comes when a joke aligns with an unspoken assumption, and Ariel felt the words land with a dull weight. Not sharp enough to provoke an immediate reaction, but heavy enough to press down on her shoulders, and she waited for Helen to correct him, to offer the neutral clarification that Ariel was a ticketed passenger like everyone else. Yet Helen only smiled, a small, professional curve of the lips that neither agreed nor disagreed, a silence that did more than words could have, because it allowed the remark to settle as truth by default. And Ariel looked down at her hands, noticing how young they seemed against the polished surface of the tray table, how easily appearance could override documentation. And she felt herself fold inward again, the practiced response to being subtly diminished, to being reminded that belonging could be conditional even when paid for. Around her, the cabin resumed its low conversation, the moment passing for everyone else, while Ariel remained suspended in it, aware now of how isolation could be engineered without confrontation, how neglect and omission could communicate exclusion more effectively than open denial. and she considered speaking up, considered naming the unfairness. But the calculation returned swift and familiar, weighing the cost of being right against the risk of being labeled, and she chose stillness instead, taking another sip of water, keeping her gaze forward, trusting that compliance would be read as innocence rather than weakness. Even as the distance between her and the rest of the cabin widened imperceptibly, and Helen from the galley glanced back once more, her smile gone, now replaced by a focused calm, as if she were monitoring an experiment already in progress, and Ariel felt the quiet pressure of that attention settle again, not loud, not urgent, but patient waiting. The way a story waits for its next excuse to continue. The cabin lights had dimmed to their cruising glow, and Ariel had drifted into a light, guarded sleep, the kind that never fully releases its hold on the world when she felt a presence close enough to change the air around her. A shadow falling across her closed eyes before a voice cut through the hum of the engines with practiced restraint. "I need to check your ticket again," and she startled awake, her hand tightening instinctively around her phone as she looked up to see Helen standing over her posture. Straight expression, composed, not apologetic for the interruption, not hurried, just firm in a way that suggested necessity rather than choice. And Ariel nodded, pushing herself upright and unlocking her screen, the familiar boarding pass reappearing with the same certainty it had carried since the gate. And she held the phone up, angling it toward Helen, expecting the brief glance and quiet acknowledgement that usually followed, yet Helen did not look down, did not scan the code or read the seat number. Her eyes stayed fixed on Ariel's face, studying it, as if the answer were written there instead. And after a beat that stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, Helen asked, "Do you have a paper copy?" Her tone neutral but weighted, and Ariel shook her head, explaining calmly that the airline no longer required printed passes, that everything was digital, now her voice steady, even as a familiar unease crept into her chest, the sense of being asked to produce something she had never been told to bring, and Helen made a small sound of acknowledgement that did not resolve anything. Her gaze never leaving Ariel's, as if she were waiting for the explanation to change, for a mistake to surface through repetition. And when none did, Helen's attention shifted abruptly upward toward the overhead bin, her eyes landing on Ariel's backpack. The canvas worn soft from years of use, its edges frayed, but its size modest, and she reached up and pressed her hand lightly against it, testing nothing at all before saying, "This bag needs to be inspected as part of a verification check," the statement delivered as a fact rather than an opinion, and Ariel followed her gaze. Confusion flickering across her face as she explained that it fit the size requirements, that it had been accepted at the gate, that it had been stored without issue. Each sentence offered gently, carefully, because she could feel the ground shifting beneath the conversation. And Helen listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, then replied, "We have to clear it under our security procedure for this cabin," and the language of procedure hung between them, vague enough to resist challenge, yet definitive enough to close the discussion. And Ariel glanced around, instinctively aware now of eyes lifting from screens of nearby conversations, pausing. The subtle tightening of attention that had marked earlier moments now returning with more focus, and she felt the heat rise again, the old calculation resurfacing as she weighed compliance against dignity, knowing that standing her ground would not address the real issue and could be reframed as resistance. And so she asked quietly what she was supposed to do, and Helen answered without hesitation. "You'll need to remove it and prepare to move," not specifying where, not offering an explanation beyond procedure, and Ariel's fingers curled around the strap of the backpack. The object suddenly heavy with implication, as if its very presence had become evidence against her, and she stood slowly, careful not to bump anyone, conscious of how movement itself could be interpreted, lifting the bag down and holding it close to her chest. And in that moment, the cabin felt smaller, the space around her compressing, as if to remind her that stillness had been safer. And Helen stepped back half a pace, giving instructions in a low voice that carried nonetheless referencing compliance and safety and the need to resolve discrepancies. phrases that sounded official enough to justify anything that followed. And Ariel realized with a tightening clarity that the scrutiny had shifted from observation to action, that the attention she had felt since boarding had found its opening. And as she stood there with her bag in hand, eyes lowered, she could sense the narrative forming around her. The quiet consensus that something was wrong, even if no one could say what. And Helen's gaze flicked once more over Ariel's face, searching not for confirmation, but for control. And Ariel felt the weight of the moment settle fully. The knowledge that the flight she had hoped would pass unnoticed was now something else entirely shaped by a question she could not answer, and a standard she could not see. And she waited, holding her breath, for the next instruction that would decide how far this first excuse would be allowed to carry her. Helen's voice carried just enough to rise above the engine's steady hush, calibrated to be heard without sounding raised as she addressed the space, rather than Ariel alone, and said, "There's a discrepancy on the manifest. You'll need to stand so we can resolve it." And the words landed with the authority of procedure, not accusation. Yet they drew a clean line around Ariel in an instant, turning her seat into a focal point, and Ariel felt the heat of attention press against her skin. Before she even moved, a quiet pause rippling outward as conversations stalled and screens dimmed, and she stood because standing felt safer than refusing, because compliance had been her shield since the gate, because she understood instinctively that the smallest hesitation could be recast as defiance. And as she rose, the cabin fell into a peculiar silence, not dramatic, not overt, but absolute in its restraint. The kind that happens when people decide to watch rather than participate. And Ariel could feel eyes lift and settle, measuring her posture, her hands the way she held her backpack close as if it were something to apologize for. And Helen remained where she was, not stepping aside to create privacy, not lowering her voice, allowing the moment to exist fully in public view. And Ariel's pulse thudded in her ears as she asked carefully whether she could see the information on the system, whether there was something specific she could help clarify her tone. Polite, her words chosen with care, and Helen did not hesitate, replying smoothly, "You're slowing down a safety process." The phrase delivered like a seal final and impersonal, transforming Ariel's reasonable request into an obstruction by definition. And with that reframing, the balance shifted because safety was no longer something that protected Ariel, but something that justified control over her. And she sensed it immediately, the subtle change in how nearby passengers leaned back, how their expressions hardened into neutrality, the quiet relief that the inconvenience had been identified and contained in a single person. Ariel tried to speak again, not to argue, but to clarify, to anchor the situation to facts that had already been verified. Yet Helen's posture closed the space, her body angled just enough to block Ariel's line of sight. Thwacked to the galley, her tone remaining even as she repeated the instruction to stand clear and wait. And the repetition itself became proof, because repetition suggested persistence, and persistence suggested guilt, in a room primed to believe it. And Ariel felt the words she might have said recede, replaced by the familiar instinct to shrink, to become unremarkable, to endure the moment until it passed. And she noticed with a distant clarity that surprised her how quickly identity could be reassigned, how a ticket and a seat number could dissolve into a problem to be managed once a label took hold. The cabin's silence thickened, not with hostility, but with detachment, as if everyone had agreed without speaking that whatever was happening was necessary. And Ariel became acutely aware of her breathing, of how loud it sounded to her, of how still she needed to be to avoid drawing further attention. And Helen's eyes flicked briefly across the nearby rows, registering the compliance of the audience, then returned to Ariel with renewed certainty. And in that look, Ariel saw not anger, but resolve, the confidence of someone who believed the process itself would carry her forward regardless of objections. And as Helen gestured for Ariel to move, referencing procedure again, the words guest and service disappeared from the exchange, entirely replaced by language of management and resolution. And Ariel understood in a way that settled heavily in her chest, that she was no longer being treated as someone to accommodate, but as something to be handled. and she tightened her grip on the backpack strap, steadying herself as she prepared to follow the instruction, aware that every movement would now be interpreted through a lens she did not control, that the room had quietly agreed on a version of events in which her presence was the irregularity. And as she took a small step forward, the silence held expectant, the kind that waits for confirmation. And Ariel felt the weight of that expectation press down, knowing that whatever came next would be shaped not by what she had done, but by what she had been allowed to become in the space of a few carefully chosen words. What happened next unfolded with the quiet efficiency of practiced motion, as if the situation had been waiting for permission rather than cause, and Helen stepped slightly aside toward the galley, angling her body away from Ariel, while keeping her voice low and controlled, speaking into the interphone with language that sounded neutral enough to pass as routine reporting that the passenger at 1A was refusing crew instructions and escalating the interaction, a phrase heavy with implication because it carried authority without evidence, and Ariel heard it even though it was not addressed to her, felt the label settle over her like a second skin, replacing everything she had been moments before. And when Helen turned back, her demeanor had shifted from supervisory to procedural, the softness gone replaced by a calm that felt immovable. And she explained that for the duration of the flight, Ariel would need to be relocated for monitoring, framing it as a standard response rather than a consequence, and Ariel opened her mouth to speak to point out that she had followed every instruction that she had stood when told moved, when directed asked only to see information that concerned her. But the words stalled as two crew members approached, summoned not by alarm, but by protocol, their expressions careful, their movements deliberate, and Ariel realized that the window for conversation had already closed because the moment had been reframed from discussion to management, and management did not require her consent. She felt a gentle but firm pressure at her elbow as she was guided forward, not pushed, not restrained, just directed with a confidence that suggested resistance would be unnecessary and unwise. And as they moved toward the forward galley, the cabin seemed to contract around her, the aisle narrowing, the air thickening with observation. And she kept her eyes forward, counting her steps, focusing on the hum of the engines to steady herself, telling herself that calm would protect her, that stillness would shorten this. And when they reached the jump seat, Helen gestured to it without ceremony, explaining that it was for turbulence protocol and observation, while the cockpit verified the manifest, her tone precise, almost reassuring, as if she were offering assistance rather than imposing control. And Ariel sat because standing felt futile now, and as she settled into the narrow seat, Helen retrieved the restraint used for crew safety, not detention, and said captain's instruction before threading it across Ariel's torso with methodical care, checking the tension, ensuring it was secure. And in that moment, Ariel understood the particular cruelty of the choice, because there were no cuffs, no visible signs that would provoke immediate outrage, only a sanctioned piece of equipment used in a context that transformed it into something else entirely. And she felt the weight of humiliation press down as the belt clicked into place, the sound quiet yet final. And she was aware of how exposed she was, positioned near the galley, where crew moved freely, where passengers could glance over as they passed. Seeing her fixed in place like an item set aside for monitoring, and Helen explained again in the language of procedure that this was temporary, that cooperation would make it easier, that safety was the priority. And each word felt like it erased another layer of Ariel's personhood, replacing it with a role she had not chosen. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced to keep them from trembling, and she focused on breathing evenly, aware that any sign of distress could be catalogued as further evidence. And around her, the flight resumed its muted rhythm. Carts rolling, voices low, the world continuing as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and that normalcy made the isolation sharper, because it suggested that what was happening to her was acceptable, explainable, justified by rules she could not see. And Helen remained nearby, her presence steady, watchful, not gloating, not apologetic, simply committed to the course she had set. And Ariel felt a profound disorientation settle in the realization that procedure could be shaped to mean whatever the person wielding it and needed it to mean, that compliance did not guarantee protection, that rules could become tools when directed with enough confidence. And she stared at a fixed point on the opposite wall, the metal latch of a cabinet reflecting the cabin lights, grounding herself in its solidity because everything else felt suddenly unstable. And she wondered how easily this could have been avoided, how a glance at a screen or a different choice of words might have diverted the path. And the thought tightened her chest because it suggested that the outcome had never been about evidence at all. And as the plane continued on its course, Ariel sat restrained, yet unmarked, contained without spectacle, aware that the quiet efficiency of the process was precisely what made it so difficult to interrupt. And she waited, listening to the low murmur of voices beyond the galley curtain, feeling the minutes stretch, understanding now that the label of non-compliance had unlocked a sequence she could no longer stop, and that whatever came next would build upon this moment of sanctioned stillness. Ariel sat restrained in the narrow jump seat with the auxiliary belt firm across her torso. Her body held still in a way that felt both conspicuous and invisible, and the plane's steady vibration hummed through her bones as time stretched into something shapeless, marked only by the passing of crew and the muted clink of service items. And she became acutely aware of the way attention moved around her, never stopping long enough to confront her directly, yet never fully leaving either a tide of glances that ebbed and returned. She noticed it first as a reflection in the brushed metal panel opposite her, a hand lifting a phone just above seatback level, the lens angled carefully to avoid drawing notice, and then another farther down the aisle, a brief shimmer of glass catching the cabin light. And though no one spoke, the knowledge settled in her chest with a slow, sinking weight, that she was being recorded not as a person, but as a moment, something to be captured and later interpreted without her voice. And she felt a sharp, involuntary urge to look up to meet the gaze of whoever was filming and ask them to stop. Yet she kept her head bowed, because looking felt like permission, because attention had already cost her too much. One phone lowered as quickly as it had risen. Another lingered for a second longer before disappearing back into a pocket, and the quiet resumed a careful quiet, the kind that signals collective withdrawal rather than peace. And Ariel realized that silence could be participatory, that choosing not to speak was also a choice with consequences, and she tightened her hands together in her lap to steady them, focusing on the familiar rhythm of her breath, counting it out to keep herself anchored. Nearby, a passenger shifted in their seat and cleared their throat. Another adjusted a screen's small sounds, filling the space where intervention might have been. And the normalcy of it all pressed in on her, the way the world continued as if nothing extraordinary were happening, and she wondered whether this was what it meant to be isolated in plain sight, to be surrounded by people yet utterly alone in the moment that mattered most. Helen's footsteps approached with a measured pace that Ariel recognized now, the soft certainty of someone who believed the situation was under control, and Helen stopped close enough that Ariel could sense her presence without looking, the faint scent of clean fabric and something floral drifting into her awareness. And then Helen bent slightly, lowering herself just enough to speak without projecting her voice, dropping to a near whisper that would not carry beyond the galley, and she said, "If you stay cooperative, this will go faster." The words light, almost reassuring, delivered with the tone one might use to calm a nervous child. And Ariel felt the sentence land like a tremor through her body, because it reframed everything again, casting obedience as the only path forward, implying that the duration of her restraint depended on her demeanor rather than the facts. And a subtle shiver ran through her, despite her effort to remain still, the realization that even her silence was now being evaluated, that patience itself had become a performance she was expected to maintain. Helen straightened and stepped back without waiting for a response, the exchange complete, and Ariel swallowed, feeling the dryness in her throat return, her pulse quickening despite her resolve, and she wondered how something so softly spoken could carry such force, how a sentence devoid of threat could still imply consequence. And she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the darkness settle. focusing on the steady pressure of the belt across her chest as a physical reminder that she was still present. Still herself, even as the narrative around her continued to shift. Another phone lifted briefly. She sensed, rather than saw it, this time the small intake of breath from someone who had decided to document rather than intervene. And she felt a strange detachment wash over her, as if she were observing the scene from a distance, noting the way fear could be diluted when shared through a screen. How recording sometimes replaced responsibility, and she held on to that thought, not in anger, but in clarity, understanding that the silence filling the cabin was not accidental, that it was constructed from many small decisions to look away, to wait, to let procedure resolve what empathy might complicate. The engines droned on. The flight attendants continued their duties with practiced calm, and Ariel remained fixed in place, her stillness now absolute. Her expression composed, her eyes lowered, and in that posture she felt both diminished and strangely resolved, aware that every second of restraint was adding weight to the moment, that the absence of spectacle did not lessen its impact, and she waited, listening to the muted life of the plane beyond the galley curtain, knowing that the quiet itself had become part of the mechanism, and that the next shift would not come with raised voices or sudden motion, but with another measured step justified by the same calm authority that had brought her here. The minutes after Helen's whisper stretched thin and brittle, each one pressing against Ariel's composure, until the need to hear a familiar voice became less a comfort than an anchor. And when she asked quietly if she could make a call, her request was framed not as a challenge but as a courtesy. Her eyes still lowered, her tone measured, and Helen considered it with the same calculated calm she had applied to every step so far, nodding once, and retrieving the cabin handset while positioning herself close enough that Ariel could feel the warmth of her presence, close enough that privacy would be impossible, yet permission would appear generous, and the phone was placed into Ariel's hand, with a reminder that this was being allowed, not owed. Ariel held the receiver, carefully aware of how the moment could be interpreted, of how any word spoken might be weighed later, and she did not dial. Her mother did not reach for comfort in the way people expected, because instinct guided her elsewhere, to the person who had taught her how to stay calm under scrutiny, how to listen before speaking, how to understand systems without trusting them. And when the line connected, she spoke only once, her voice steady, despite the tightness in her chest. "Dad, I'm being held on the plane," and the sentence carried everything she could not say aloud, the restraint, the watching eyes, the rules turned sideways, and on the other end, Jonathan Moore did not ask for explanations, or reasons did not demand details that would require her to relive the last hour. He did not raise his voice or express disbelief. He simply asked, "Are you hurt?" And the simplicity of the question cut through the tension with unexpected force, because it acknowledged her body before her behavior, her safety before her compliance, and Ariel felt something inside her loosen just enough to allow a breath she had not realized she was holding. And she answered honestly, saying that she was not injured, that she was just restrained, and Jonathan listened without interrupting his silence, attentive rather than empty. And Helen remained close, her presence a constant reminder that the conversation was not truly private. Yet the words exchanged seemed to exist in a space beyond her reach, because they were grounded not in procedure but in care. And Ariel found herself focusing on that difference, on the way concern could sound when it was genuine, how it did not rush to assign fault or seek justification. And Jonathan asked where she was seated now, what she could see, whether she could breathe comfortably, each question, precise, each one, reinforcing that he was building an understanding rather than reacting to a narrative. And Ariel answered quietly, choosing her words with care, aware that Helen's proximity might shape how the call was perceived later. And still she did not embellish or minimize, she described only what was, trusting that accuracy would matter more than emotion. And when Jonathan said he would handle it, the phrase did not sound like a promise of rescue, so much as a commitment to process, a steady assurance that the situation would be addressed without theatrics. And Helen shifted slightly, perhaps sensing the shift in tone, perhaps noting the way Ariel's shoulders eased even as her restraint remained. And when the call ended, the receiver was taken back with professional efficiency, Helen offering no commentary, no acknowledgement of what had been said, and Ariel rested her hands again in her lap, the quiet returning with a different texture, now less suffocating, edged with anticipation rather than fear. And she noticed how the cabin felt subtly altered, not visibly changed, but charged with the sense that something had been set in motion beyond the confines of the aircraft. Something that would intersect with the controlled world Helen had built through careful words and procedures. Ariel kept her gaze forward, her breathing slow, aware that the restraint still held her in place, that the rules governing her movement had not shifted. And yet she felt a fragile steadiness take root, the knowledge that someone outside this enclosed space had been alerted not to her behavior, but to her condition. And that distinction mattered more than anything she could have said in her own defense. And as the plane continued its course, engines steady cabin orderly, Ariel waited in the narrow seat, feeling the belt against her chest. And the weight of the moment settled into something quieter and more resolute, aware that the call had not ended the situation, but had changed its trajectory, even if the next step had not yet revealed itself. The cockpit door closed with a muted finality that did not reach the cabin, but altered it nonetheless. A subtle change in pressure that Ariel could not see yet somehow felt. And Captain Lewis sat forward in his seat with the manifest open on the screen in front of him, his expression neutral in the way that came from decades of filtering urgency through discipline. Because the request he had received was not dramatic, not framed as an emergency, only a quiet verification routed through the proper channel, yet it carried a specificity that made it impossible to dismiss. He scrolled past the abbreviated list that crews often relied on during routine flights and opened the full manifest, the version with annotations that were easy to overlook when nothing seemed out of place. And there it was. The seat assignment confirmed, the payment verified, the passenger name matching the record with no discrepancy at all. And Captain Lewis paused, reading it twice. Not because he doubted what he saw, but because he understood what it implied. And he leaned back slightly, his eyes lifting as he considered the sequence of events he had been briefed on the report of non-compliance, the relocation from monitoring the call placed under supervision. And he turned his head toward Helen, who stood just inside the cockpit doorway posture, composed hands folded waiting, and he asked evenly, "Did you review this section?" His tone not accusatory, simply precise, and the question hung in the air between them, measured and unavoidable. And Helen did not answer immediately, not because she had nothing to say, but because the question disrupted the structure she had built, forcing attention back to a detail she had chosen not to foreground. And in that pause, Captain Lewis saw enough to understand that the omission had not been accidental. Outside the cockpit, the cabin remained unaware of the exchange. Passengers settling into the long middle stretch of the flight screens, glowing softly, conversations hushed, yet the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was difficult to articulate. A heaviness settling in that had nothing to do with turbulence. And Ariel sensed it too, from her place in the jump seat, the belt still firm across her chest, the air around her seeming denser, as if the plane itself were holding something back. Captain Lewis made a decision that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures, only a rerouting of intention, and he contacted ground control to coordinate a remote stand upon arrival, framing it as a precautionary measure to address a cabin issue, and the request was acknowledged without comment. Procedure: absorbing the deviation with quiet efficiency. When the aircraft began its descent, the usual announcements did not come. No reassurance about weather or connections, only the mechanical sounds of preparation. And passengers noticed the absence, even if they could not name it, the lack of explanation sharpening their awareness. And when the plane touched down and rolled not toward the familiar gate lights, but toward a distant section of the tarmac, the confusion grew palpable. Whispers passing between seats. Glances exchanged, the sense that something was wrong, pressing in without a clear source. And Ariel felt the vibration of the wheels through the seat, the belt holding her steady. And she wondered if this was connected to the call, if the quiet assurance she had felt earlier had translated into motion. Yet she kept her face composed, her breathing, even because nothing had been said aloud to confirm it. And Helen moved through the galley with a controlled urgency that did not invite questions, her expression unreadable as she adjusted her stance near the forward door and the plane came to a stop far from the terminal. The engines winding down into a silence that felt heavier than sound, and no one spoke because no one had been told what to say. The cabin suspended in a collective pause that pressed against every seat, every thought, the weight of uncertainty settling like lead as the doors remained closed and the air seemed to wait for whatever would come next. The forward door opened without ceremony, and 2 airport security officers stepped onto the aircraft, first their posture calm, but unmistakably official, and Jonathan Moore followed a step behind them with the unhurried control of someone who understood that volume was unnecessary. When clarity would suffice, his posture composed, his eyes scanning the space not for spectacle, but for one specific presence, and the cabin seemed to register him instinctively. A collective stillness settling, as if the air itself had recognized authority without being told to. And when his gaze found Ariel seated in the jump seat near the galley, restrained yet upright, her expression controlled, his steps slowed not from hesitation but from care. And he approached her without looking at Helen or anyone else, kneeling just enough to bring his eyes level with his daughter's. His voice low, steady, carrying only to her as he said, "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." And the simplicity of the sentence cut through the tension with a force no accusation could match, because it named responsibility without assigning blame. And Ariel felt the words settle into her chest, not as rescue, but as recognition. And she nodded once, unable to speak, yet not needing to, because the apology had acknowledged what the procedures had erased, that time mattered, that presence mattered, that she had been alone when she should not have been. Jonathan's eyes moved then briefly to her wrists, where faint red marks still traced the shape of restraint against her skin. And though he did not comment, the tightening of his jaw was visible, a quiet recalibration rather than anger, and he rose to his feet and turned toward Captain Lewis, who stood a few steps back, posture attentive, his expression grave but controlled. And the exchange between them was brief, professional, grounded in verification rather than confrontation. The kind of conversation that closed gaps instead of widening them. And Helen stood to the side, her earlier certainty diminished into a rigid stillness, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the conversation, as if not looking might delay consequence. The auxiliary restraint was removed without fanfare. The belt unlatched. Ariel standing slowly, her movements deliberate, reclaiming her balance, and when Jonathan placed a hand lightly at her back, it was not to guide her, but to signal that she was no longer required to navigate the space alone, and the cabin remained silent, not out of fear, but out of awareness. The kind that comes when a narrative resolves itself without needing commentary. The disembarkation that followed was quiet and orderly. The aircraft still positioned away from the terminal, the passengers waiting without explanation, yet no longer restless, as if the weight they had felt earlier had shifted into something resolved. And Ariel walked down the aisle with her head level, not seeking eye contact, not avoiding it, either simply moving forward. And Jonathan followed at a respectful distance, allowing her to lead because the moment belonged to her. The investigation that followed unfolded over weeks rather than days, methodical and thorough, grounded in records and timelines rather than impressions. And Helen's actions were examined not through intent, but through impact, supported by the incident log, crew communications, and passenger footage that documented how routine language became unlawful restraint. And when the findings were released, they were precise and unemotional, documenting misuse of authority and failure to adhere to passenger rights. And Helen was dismissed from her position, facing formal regulatory and civil proceedings that addressed the gravity of what procedure had been allowed to justify. Months later, in a crowded public service area where lines moved slowly and patience wore thin, Ariel encountered Helen again by chance, the setting ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of place where people waited without privilege or protection, and Helen stood behind a counter. Now her posture smaller, her movements careful, and when her eyes lifted and met Ariel's, recognition flickered and settled into something like restraint, her gaze dropping her shoulders, drawing inward, and Ariel did not stop, did not pause to speak or acknowledge the moment. She simply walked past her pace. Steady, her presence unburdened, not because forgiveness had been granted or withheld, but because the need to explain herself had dissolved. And as she moved on, blending back into the flow of people, she understood with quiet certainty that belonging was no longer something she had to negotiate or prove. It was something she carried with her intact, unchallenged, and sufficient. If this story resonated with you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. I'd love to know what moment stood out to you the most, and where you're watching from today. Share your thoughts in the comments.